ready to embark on the next phase of our studies, and that's the pentatonic scales. I'll be returning to the key of C major for this session, so we don't clutter up the discussion with any talk of sharps or flats. Let's begin with definition. Pentatonic scale, from the Greek for five, is a scale which divides the octave into 5 intervals. That's 5 distinct notes plus the octave. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and octave. This contrasts with the classical diatonic scales, that is to say the major and minor scales, which divide the octave into 7 intervals. In the history of music, pentatonic scales predate the diatonic scales, and they form the basis of many traditional musical styles around the world. Nevertheless, they're still used in contemporary music, and are often used for improvisation in jazz, pop and rock styles, not least because in a great many positions they're playable with just 2 fingers on each string. This means that it's relatively easy to build up a good head of steam for fast, flashy soloing. Okay, now we know that pentatonic is a scale of 5 intervals, so what are these intervals going to be? Well, in theory, any division of the octave into 5 intervals can be classed as a pentatonic scale, but the conventional pentatonics are derived from the diatonic scale by removing the semitone intervals to create a pattern of tone and minor third intervals. So for a first example, if we want to derive a major pentatonic from the major scale, we first look to see where the semitone intervals fall, and in this case they land between the 3rd and 4th and between the 7th and octave. Well, the octave is the same note as the tonic, so we can't lose this note from the scale, which means the first thing that has to go is the 7th. This leaves us with... Now let's consider the 3rd and 4th. We want to create a major pentatonic, and it's the 3rd that defines any scale or chord or arpeggio as major or minor, so this one has to stay. This means that in effect we're left with no choice. We have to lose the 4th and the 7th to create the pattern of tonic, major 2nd, major 3rd, perfect 5th, major 6th and octave. Now if we use this pentatonic pattern to fit with the 1 chord in the key of C major, we get an open position fingering of C, the 2nd, open D, the 3rd, E, the 5th, open G, the major 6th, A at fret 2 on string 3, and the octave C at fret 1, string 2. This is a pentatonic pattern that will fit with any major chord, and indeed, as there's no 7th in the pentatonic, it can also be played against any major 7th or dominant 7th chord. However, I'm going to go on and look at some variants of this pentatonic to fit with the 4 chord and the 5 chord. These variants are derived from the modes, and before you throw your hands up in horror, I know I haven't spoken about the modes yet, so if you're not familiar with modes already, simply follow the discussion and learn these pentatonic patterns. Later on, when we come to examine the modes in some depth, the logic behind these pentatonics will become a bit more apparent. So going on to the pentatonic for the 4 chord, that's F in the key of C major. You can replace the 5th in this pentatonic with a sharpened 4th. The technical term for this is an augmented 4th. The 4th is a perfect interval, so it can't become major or minor, and just as when a perfect interval is flattened it becomes diminished, when a perfect interval is sharpened it becomes augmented. Just to complete the picture on augmented and diminished intervals, when a major interval is sharpened it becomes augmented, and when a minor interval is flattened it becomes diminished. And you will no doubt have noticed that this interval of an augmented 4th is exactly the same as the diminished 5th. However, we're pairing this pentatonic pattern against a chord that already contains a perfect 5th, so augmented 4th is the correct term in this case. Now let's take a look at this pentatonic for F in the open position. That will be F at fret 1 string 6, G at fret 3, the open A string, the major third, the augmented fourth of B at fret 2, string 5, the major sixth on the open D string, string 4, and the octave F at fret 3, string 4. We can extend this pattern into the upper octave with another G on the open string 3, A at fret 2, string 3, the augmented fourth of B at fret 4, or the open B string, major sixth of D at fret 3, string 2, and the F at fret 1, string 1. I should sound a note of caution here when using pentatonic patterns in the melody. We've now created a pentatonic in which only 2 of the 5 notes are actually chord tones, albeit the most important two, the root and third. In general, the pentatonic is a pattern of 5 notes, and here we're playing them against chords of 3 or 4 notes, so there's bound to be at least one note in the pentatonic which is not in the chord, sometimes more, because not all the chord tones will always appear in the pentatonic. Now, if we sustain a non-chord tone in the melody, this will have the effect of changing the structure and nature of the chord, or possibly causing a dissonance or discord against one or more of the chord tones. So as a very general rule, these notes are used in the melody as passing notes of relatively brief duration. As with all general rules, this is there to be broken when you feel the occasion demands it. You might, for example, want to create the effect of a 9th, 11th or 13th chord, but feel that the extra note is prominent enough in the melody that it doesn't need to be added to the accompaniment. Later on in the series, we'll talk about the concept of suspension and resolution, where a dissonant interval moves to a consonant or harmonious interval, creating an effect of tension and release. And you may want to create this kind of effect in the melody, again without necessarily adding the extra notes to the accompanying chords. Okay, now let's move on to the 5 chord, which would be a G in the key of C major. And in this case, we can vary the pentatonic by replacing the major 6th with a minor 7th. In contrast to the previous example, we've now added a chord tone to the pentatonic. This means that the pentatonic now contains all the notes of the dominant 7th chord, with just one note, the 2nd, which doesn't appear in the chord. So to find this pentatonic for G in the open position, we can simply take the G7 arpeggio and add the 2nd of A at the open A string and in the upper octave at fret 2, string 3. Now play these pentatonic patterns in sequence following the chord progression, just as we did with the arpeggio patterns. And just as with the arpeggio patterns, we can make adjustments to the fingering to ease the transition from one pentatonic to the next. For example, ending the C major pentatonic with fingers 3 and 2 instead of fingers 2 and 1. To start the F pentatonic with finger 1, which we can then end with finger 4 to start the G pentatonic with finger 3. And as with the arpeggio patterns, we can practice these pentatonics in ascending form, a descending form, and for the back and forth pattern, I keep the time signature regular simply by repeating the octave. Where we have an upper octave available in the open position, in this case for the F and G pentatonics, we can practice that as well. Now you may be wondering why we're using these different forms of the pentatonic for each of the chords of the chord progression. One reason is that this helps to emphasize the tonality of the progression as a whole, that is to say, the key we're playing in. Of course, you may not always want to do this. For example, if you're in a piece of music which is modulating, that is to say, it's in the process of changing from one key to another, you might want to include a passage consisting of notes which appear in both of the keys, thus making the change smoother and perhaps disguising the point at which the key change actually takes place. Equally, you may simply feel that a melody based on the more generic form of the major pentatonic makes for a nicer tune. But however you choose to use or not to use these patterns, by learning the unique form of the pentatonic for each chord of the harmonized scale, you are expanding the range of options available to you, and at the very least, if you treat them as simple finger exercises, you're working your fingers in a greater variety of combinations which must have a payoff in terms of developing dexterity and versatility. Okay, here endeth today's lesson. In the next video, we're going to look at the transposable fingerings for these 3 pentatonic scales. So until then, I bid you farewell.